The West does not have a noble history in Africa. For centuries it has used and abused that continent for its own financial and political gain. Today, colonial governments, such as this one in London, are once again spreading trouble across the African continent, but this time with a new excuse: a fight against terror. Since 2008, both the United States and a number of European Union member countries have been actively operating in Africa in what amounts to a crusade labelled the War on Terror. Recently, the governments of France and America have even moved intelligence and military resources into Nigeria to fight the Boko Haram Takfiri militants, in a way which removes some authority for national security from Nigeria's own government. And as always, the West uses the same familiar justification, namely that Africa is a major contributor to international terrorism. So what effect has all this Western activity had on reducing the threat of terrorism? Why have countries like Nigeria not done more to deal with it themselves? And what is the public view of this modern-day form of imperialism? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began by asking the public how they would define imperialism in the 21st century and what effect they feel that imperialism has on the countries that experience it. Here's what they said. What, in your view, is imperialism, and what effect has it had on countries that have suffered it?
Difficult to say at this stage, so long after it happened. Certainly it was caused problems in the past, I would say, yeah.
What kind of problems?
Well, yeah, us going into different countries and sort of using their resources and then using them as labour as well, so that we can make loads of money.
Well, I believe that most of the infrastructure that were put in place before the masters left were adequate enough, because most of the natives were not consulted during the time of occupation. So the infrastructure there hasn't really helped them at all. And so I feel that imperialism, rather than help, has more or less denigrated the nations, actually. And so there's not much left really for them to be able to use to further the causes of their economy.
What does imperialism mean to you, and what impact does it have when it happens to a country?
Well, it seems, I was about to say it seems like an old-fashioned sort of term for British Empire and all that, but I guess it happens nowadays with more modern countries like America. But seems to be a bigger power taking over a smaller power, and it seems to be a negative impact on the smaller power on the whole.
Imperialism has caused debt into the countries which were conquered, and the countries are still paying debt up to now. So I think there's a lot of debt attached to whatever was started years ago.
So a range of views from the public about the nature of imperialism. But is there a definition of 21st century imperialism, and do we have evidence of what that causes to the countries that experience it? We asked our experts.
Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence, actually, through military and colonial methods. And yeah, there's a lot of negative effects of imperialism, because if you look back to the history of Africa, for example, which is the continent we are talking about, you find that when colonialism took place in Africa, many different countries, there was forced occupation of land. People were chased from their land, and when they were chased from their land, they were lumped up together, and most of them were living in concentration camps. And these concentration camps were guarded by soldiers, you know, in many different countries. And in the end, these people, these Africans, they lost their land permanently. This land was taken by occupying settlers. And many countries in Africa to date, the land issue is still happening. That land in many countries has never been fully recovered to the owners. Displacement of people as well, as in terms of when their way of life, their culture, their political or traditional systems were disrupted as well. That means as well that order in the societies went missing. And that has affected Africans in different countries in different ways as we speak, even as of now?
Imperialism is very much when one particular country decides that it wants to dominate a series of other countries, and usually takes the form of an aggressive nature, usually through war, intimidation, and sometimes violence. And usually those that are oppressed feel it that much more. The imperialists, as we've seen over time, over generations, over many, many years, are always there predominantly to control, to influence, to take control of the land, and ultimately to control the resources. And we've seen that over time across many countries throughout Africa.
So we have a definition, but why do some colonial powers exercise an imperialistic policy? Where do they do it? And which countries are they? We asked the public if they knew. Which countries have done the most invading? Which countries have controlled the most? Why have they done it? Where have they done it?
I'm French, so I know French people used to do that. They done that for Mali and all of these kind of countries. I mean, because definitely it helped this kind of country to, for everything related to economy, to their business. So this is where I think it could be dangerous. But I mean, it's always like this, so, and that it always be like this. So
Russia, I guess, is probably the greatest modern example of imperialism in terms of the countries that it used to own that are no longer part of it. Yeah.
Any other countries?
Imperialism. Well, I guess we are as well, definitely. The Commonwealth's obviously one of the biggest parts of history.
Can you think of any countries that you associate with that, and why have they done it? Where have they done it?
Probably most of Western Europe, to be honest, has done it at some point or another. So UK, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain. So whole load, I think, at some point in history.
I think it's like the United Kingdom and America. Yeah, those two. Yeah, that's it.
So range of views and mixed opinions from the public there. But why do some countries exercise an imperialistic policy? Which countries are they, and where do they exercise it? We asked our experts.
If we go back to history, in 1884, the Berlin Conference on Africa, it is here where the map of Africa was created. Africa was divided into different colonies. A lot of countries which are mostly from Europe. We have France, we have Britain, we have Germany, we have the Dutch occupying South Africa, went to Africa, what we call scramble for Africa, to occupy these new countries. Technically the issue, their appetite was land, it was resources, it was raw materials. Again, it was about dominance. Politically, it was about occupying those territories in perpetuity and probably claim ownership in perpetuity. And therefore, when you look into that particular history, 1884, the Berlin Conference on Africa, the division of African continent into colonies, that tells you that the countries which were responsible for this particular act, most of them were European countries as well.
Yeah, I think the most popular of imperialist states would be Britain, simply because they were colonial masters, they were a former superpower, and of course they went out deliberately to colonize the world and change its perception so that it fitted very much what Britain's ideology was. And to that extent, those that were who felt the full force of imperialism thought that they were being either enslaved or controlled, and in fact the legacy of that are being felt generations after that event. So Britain clearly had an imperialistic agenda, but I think imperialism links very closely to world domination, and world domination itself looks at superpowers. And to that extent, we've had Britain, we've had now the United States that's a superpower, and there's already undertones of them using the influence that they have, the financial muscle that they control, the dominance that they have with their military capabilities to truly change other countries. And that said, many of those who live in those countries feel that they're being oppressed.
Time to get focused and look at Africa specifically. We wondered if the public were aware of imperialistic activity on that continent in recent years and what they thought of it. Here's what they said. Can you think of any 21st century examples of imperialism, for example, in Africa, where the West has interfered there?
Well, no, but in the Middle East, certainly, yeah. Maybe not in Africa as such, that I know of anyway.
What kind of things in the Middle East?
Well, I think, you know, us going in and supposedly sorting out countries like Iraq and then leaving before the job was actually done and leaving a power vacuum, and you can see the problems that are happening there now.
Well, I think the Chinese are doing a very good job of that. So that's another case in point, because what they tend to do is that they go in with money in hand, offering to build infrastructure, but most of the things that they tend to do doesn't necessarily help the nations, because they bring in their own workforce. So the money is siphoned back to China again, so the money doesn't stay in the country. And that's a horrible, at least with the European imperialist masters, they left the money there. These people have just taken the money back. So I would say the modern imperialistic nation would have to be China.
Yeah, definitely. You can tell by the wars and the civil wars that are going on in between countries, neighbouring countries, that's happening.
So quite a varied understanding of the effect of imperialism in 21st century Africa. We asked our experts if there were patterns and who was mainly responsible.
21st century kind of imperialism has got many aspects. It appears in different aspects, if I may say so. You have economic control, you have political control, you have social control, and also you have the cultural control of people. I'll give you an example of current form of imperialism. Many countries not long ago, if you just go there about late or mid-80s, many countries in Africa were at the mercy of the Bretton Woods institutions. We are talking of IMF, we are talking about the World Bank. And these countries, if you see, these institutions are controlled by the Western capitalist states, the superpowers. Their say in them is very crucial. And therefore, using these particular institutions, they were in a position to force the Western model of democracy in African countries. In many countries, because of their economies, again, being dependent on aid from the West, these givers of aid were in a position to give conditions, preconditions. For example, you find a country like Kenya or Tanzania or Rwanda being told, look, you have to adopt the Western model of democracy. Those are the conditions. Economically, you have to introduce SAPs or structural and adjustment programs. So with failure to which, you're not going to be given that aid. So when you look into that aid, it's not per se aid, because it's money you are given to pay back at a very high rate. And that actually, the World Bank and the IMF, I do say most of the time, are pretty much responsible of sustaining a culture of dependency in many countries in Africa. These countries, presidents after presidents from different countries got into power looking up to IMF and World Bank, rather than thinking on their toes, thinking about what they have in their country, thinking about inspiring Africans to work harder and changing their economy to depend on itself.
Imperialism in Africa has taken many different forms, and the most recent of forms have been seen in countries like Mali, Central African Republic, in countries like even in Libya, most recently with the ousting of Gaddafi. And many would say also the change of guards in the wider People's Republic that has cut across North Africa in terms of the revolutions that we've seen. Many of the leaders that have been chosen, many of the leaders that have been sanctioned have actually got a Western agenda or a Western-driven policy. That said, the imperialistic mindset of the dominant countries, be it Europeans or the United States, influence those countries and their leadership structure through support. And we see that support mechanism either affecting the people, affecting the countries themselves, but ultimately change of the guards in terms of how the minerals are extracted and very much how multinationals take a huge slice of the country's wealth. So imperialism can be seen in many different tones, and the effects are felt on the ground in these countries. These countries usually are fragile. These countries usually have problems with their democracies. These countries usually have problems with the sort of leadership structures they have in place. But sometimes these leaders that exist, be it they're supported by the imperialists or are asking for change through the imperialist interference, we see change come what may. And this is the problem, that change through imperialism sometimes is wrong, and the effect are felt generations after generations.
Sudan has been divided in two. Military leaders have been installed. A genocide has occurred in the Central African Republic, with small children, Muslim children, being beheaded. All of this has occurred despite the presence of the West in the name of the war on terror. How could it all have gone so wrong? We asked the public for their opinion. Why is it that the West has not succeeded in stopping terrorism in Africa? They've used it as an excuse to go there.
Because I think there is like, how can I say that? Probably because they don't want to fix these issues in Africa, probably because it's helped Occident countries.
I'm no expert on the war in terror in Africa, but I think the word you use there is an excuse. I think that's the general public's feeling, that it is an excuse, in the same way that weapons of mass destruction was an excuse to invade in the Middle East to essentially secure oil rights. That's clearly summarising a much bigger argument into one sentence, but yeah, I think it probably is an excuse. There are all sorts of factions and wars going on there that, frankly, I think a lot of people in the Western world don't understand and shouldn't try and understand. You know, there are cultures and histories there that we're not part of, and we shouldn't try and dictate what goes on there.
Why has the West failed to fix all these problems it claims it can fix?
Because they don't understand the people's cultures, and they don't understand the people's aspects and notions. They've just gone in there, given people constitutional laws which mainly impact on the Western world other than the African constitution, where there were clans originally, clans and tribes, and I think so, the tribes and clans, that's all.
So a good degree of confusion and uncertainty about why so much has gone wrong despite the presence of the West. We asked our experts to see if they could explain what is actually failing in terms of the Western intervention and the so-called war on terror.
The use of war on terror is a huge word for which many Muslims have felt the rough end of that change. The movement of Western-driven agenda has meant that the so-called drone use has been despised. We have seen how it affects communities through discriminate bombings. We have seen how its targeting of certain individuals affects the community, and ultimately we have seen how the war on terror has been extended to take away liberties of the people. It's literally eroding civil rights movements. Ultimately, the use of drones, the use of technology to control people, to spy on people, to overshadow what is actually truly happening in terms of land grab, in terms of resource control, in terms of change of leadership and structure, has literally hijacked many democracies in the real sense. Ultimately, what we do find is that the imperialists always use control mechanisms, and the use of drones is just one extension of that, controlling the people, providing intimidation and fear.
Nigeria has fought an effective campaign against terrorists in the past and even killed one of its key leaders. And yet, since the abduction of nearly 300 schoolgirls, Nigeria has stood condemned for doing not nearly enough. Is that because it can't do anything, or because it has some underlying motive to either provoke a Western intervention, or is it even to do with oil relationships between Nigeria and America? We asked the public. Do you think that the West uses terrorism as an excuse to go into countries?
Oh yeah, we've done that all the time. Historically, it's just always been the case. Yeah.
I think that there isn't any underlying motive other than the fact that basically the country is extremely corrupt. The soldiers and most of the people within the hierarchy are not being paid, and they don't feel that they need to basically commit themselves to a cause that would invariably end up in a fatal position. So if you're not being paid properly, why should I go and kill myself? And this is what's causing the problem.
Yeah, there's definitely a possibility. They could be attracting a different strategy, but it could just be the fact that it's getting worse, the terrorism there, and it's on a larger scale than it's been on before.
So why is it that Nigeria seems unable to handle its internal terrorist difficulties? Why does it seem willing to invite others in to assist with this problem? Is there an underlying strategy which perhaps hasn't been obvious? We asked our experts.
The bottom line is that Boko Haram started in Nigeria as a localized force that was sponsored by politicians themselves. It was politicians who used them in the elections to intimidate each other. And it was after the fact that Boko Haram's needs were not recognized by their original political backers that Boko Haram took a different turn, a turn for the West to fight the individuals who were originally backing them. That said, Boko Haram came face to face, force to force, bullet to bullet against the Nigerian army. That said, the selection and the abduction of girls is wrong. Boko Haram should never, ever do a thing like that. And their actions have put them in direct firing line, not necessarily against Nigeria, but against the entire world. There's always going to be undertones of imperialistic agenda as to why are they choosing to help Nigeria at this junction. Is it because of Nigeria's resources? Is it because, as they say, that Boko Haram potentially can become a global problem? Is it because that Boko Haram, as they see it, has already formed an alliance with groups like Al-Qaeda? Or is it because that they deeply feel that Nigeria, being the next superpower on the African continent, is one for which they need to have influence? And by supporting Goodluck Jonathan's administration in ousting, hopefully, Boko Haram, containing Boko Haram, they believe that they will have a foothold with their own companies having control of the Nigerians' oil wealth, which we know they do have in plentiful supply.
We often hear of the West's military involvement in places like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, but the militaristic policies of America and the European Union in Africa are the forgotten war, despite the increasing intervention of those colonial states in that continent. When the West has tried to impose its will on Africa in the past, it has led to violence and revolution. Yet that cycle seems to be starting again. And as any scholar can tell you, those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to relive them.